Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Total Recall podcast with me, Will Bourne. And I'm joined now by a very exciting guest where we're going to talk about product and how to get a product built and get a startup built and all the fun things that come with being a startup founder at Kyle Forster. It's great to see you again, Kyle.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate this.
My pleasure. I actually recall back when I first met you at KubeCon in Chicago. So much great insight. I asked you a lot of what probably seems silly questions, but I really learned a lot from you. And I think the audience that listens to this podcast, typically techies and people that are trying to build and scale their own organizations, could really learn a lot from you. You've achieved quite a lot, so I really do appreciate you coming on.
No, I appreciate it. Look, I had so much help in my earlier companies. I've had so much help in my current company that if there's anything that I can do to pay it back, or rather to pay it forward for more entrepreneurs, I'm just happy to help. I had so much of this advice coming through.
Yeah, it's one of the great things I've found about this community. The Dev First community, the KubeCon community, the people that are startup founders, just the willingness to help and support and ask nothing in return. It's a great community. And this kind of topic really that I want to talk to you about is, as I said before we hit the record button, a couple of great books that I've read. One was really around how to survive economic downturns, recessions, call it what you will, bubble bursts, it might be, and where you've got a product and perhaps, in fact, let's take it back. You're trying to build a product, whether it's an iteration of a product, whether it's a market pivot, whatever it might be, to give some people advice, because looking at your backgrounds, Google, director of project management in their Kubernetes division, founder of Big Switch Networks, an acquisition, a very successful endeavor there. So I think it'd be good to just, I suppose, dive in to the deep end and just, I suppose, talk me through the process. What's your process of you have an idea, you have a concept. How do you get that into production and get to launch without your startup becoming a statistic, a negative statistic?
Sure. Well, look, I've been part of four startups now, the founder of two, but I've also been part of two big companies, Cisco and Google. I don't know, very brief stint at Microsoft. But I found the process of launching a V1.0 product at one of these large companies, it's not that different from the process of launching a new product in a new company. I think in both cases, you wind up, if you're going to be sort of the senior person on the product, you wind up with only 50 or 60% of your time on the product and on your customers themselves, because in a big company, you're constantly worried about managing up levels or managing side to side to make sure that you can kind of persuade people to come along the journey with you. And in a small company, you're constantly managing up to maintain your funding levels.
Yeah. Constantly hits the bat. All right, funding runway.
When you're not doing that, then you're worrying about finance topics that you never thought you'd have to worry about, and worrying about HR topics you never thought you'd have to worry about. So either way, you kind of have to be ready that you have to manage all of this in 60 to 70% of your time, and sometimes even less. Which a lot of people, I don't think, see that at the outset. That you actually have to be successful with a very limited amount of time, even if you are working 24 hours in a day.
Yeah, you've got to be the master of time management and diary management for sure. I would say working in blocks and being very specific in what you're doing in that time is useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where would you start then? So, if there are founders listening who they either are wanting to build a product or they have a product that they're wanting to pivot, I know they're two very different topics in their own right that could have, well, they probably do have much literature written on them. Where would you start? If you pick an example of your career where let's start with pivoted a product. What was the product? Why did you pivot? How did you pivot?
Well, first, just for the purpose of conversation, let's break the new product lifecycle down in a couple of phases. To me, there's this first phase of pre-product market fit. And we can go into exactly what that means. For me personally, that's actually the most interesting phase. My guess is for an awful lot of the people who are listening to this, that's probably the phase that they're in. Once you've found product market fit, then to me, there's going from product market fit to go to market fit, where, okay, you've now identified this group of customers that desperately need your product, that are okay working with a very early stage company and a very early stage product. But at the end of that period, you figured out, okay, here's how we create a scalable go-to-market motion. to find them over and over again. So it's not like me calling my friends. And then there's another stage after that on scaling. And that has its own unique and very special challenges. And very often there are very specific, unique, and special professionals that do that extraordinarily well. But let's just talk about called pre-product market fit. I've advised a lot of entrepreneurs at this point, and I would say there's a very specific failure mode, especially with strong engineers and strong technical founders, that they spend way too much time building the MVP and nowhere near enough time validating that the problem that they're solving is the right problem. Some of the best books I've read on this topic, I think Steven Finger's 4 Steps to the Epiphany is a fantastic book on this topic. I think that Bill Tinker, a former mentor of mine, his book on Survival to Thrival is a fantastic book. Even though he says the book focuses on the next step after, I think it's the chapters that he writes on pre-product market fit are some of the best out there.
Nice. I'll put links to those books in the comments so people can download them.
I think they're just very strong.
Mm.
The gist with the sheer amount of time that founders of products and companies, small and large, spend solving a theoretical problem only to figure out that they can't any customer actually have the problem that they solve. I would say that's the vast majority of products that I've seen in my life. That's not some, that's like the vast majority. I've been pulled in as like the turnaround product manager in a handful as well. And you could just tell the team had this very strong sense of the problem they were trying to solve. And they couldn't find anybody.
And do you think that's like, the excitement of, maybe they're a first time founder, I don't know, but the excitement of I'm going to build a life-changing product. It's the silver bullet for this, that, and the other. And they just get into the build without really going and speaking to 50 plus people about, is this actually a product we need? Do you think that's the case? Is it like an excitement factor?
I absolutely think so. I think there are 3 root causes. One is called the Farfignugan, like the joy of driving, this thrill of building a new product. Because when you're your own judge and jury on a product, you look like a genius. And especially if you have a small number of people working with you, you all feel like geniuses and it feels fantastic. And it's a wonderful feeling. And it's such a shame that it creates so little economic value. There's the second failure mode that I've seen where people talk to a lot of customers, but what they're doing is they're just pitching a lot of customers without asking the right questions. And so they end this meetings where they've talked 90% of the time. And they said just because the other person didn't hang up on them, that they must want the product. And that's the bar that is far too low a bar. Yeah. Some of the questions I like to kind of coach people into are things like, okay, at the midpoint of the meeting, ask, would you buy this if I finished building it? Before somebody even takes the meeting saying, hey, here's what we're looking at building. Would you do a meeting if we built it for you? Would you buy it after? Or if not, would you buy it for higher price products? Then it's, would you promise to be one of our beta users? Because if somebody's going to commit their own personal time, sometimes that's this lower bar than committing their company's money. But it's a valid question to ask.
You still suggest like giving that away for free? Even in the beta phase, would you say like come and use it and you can use it for free? Because I have conflicting answers to that question.
I tend to believe that for at least the enterprise infrastructure style products that I do, if we charge 0, the product still probably costs the end user $25,000 to $100,000. So I think if you look at the total cost of acquisition, I mean, the cost of onboarding a new vendor for most mid and large size enterprises is $10,000 just to do the paperwork to onboard a new vendor. So even if the vendor's charging 0. So I tend to think if you take a holistic view of like how expensive your product is for the customer with your price tag being part of it, you should find an appropriate price.
Okay. And I interrupted your flow. Sorry, you were just talking about asking what I think a lot of people are afraid to ask, the difficult questions, all the answers they actually need are in the questions they don't want to ask. Would you buy this thing? There's a great book actually, The Mom Test, which I read, which I think is a good framework to follow on that.
I think the man test is a great one. I think sometimes, there's a follow-on question where if somebody's getting fuzzy answers, if you've already had one meeting, for example, and you're having your second, and somebody says, oh, I was just too busy to take a look at your materials. Really? What were you too busy doing? There's a wonderful magic one, like, is this on your personal top 5 priority lists to solve this year?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What is? I'm quite extreme that I believe very little economic value is created by building the MVP. I believe a huge amount of economic value is actually created by having enough user interviews that you can very clearly articulate, here are the top 3 or 4 problems that my target customer is trying to solve because I've heard them 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times. And then trying to solve that particular problem, because that primary user research is actually very hard to do well.
Yeah, especially if you're asking the wrong questions. You're taking all the time to get all these data points, and the feedback is wishy-washy, or it's yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I worked with a company some years ago, and they were a psychometric testing company. And the CEO of that company, I asked him, how many actual data points do you need before you consider it usable data? And he said, in every case, it's a minimum of 50. Once you've spoke to 50 people as a minimum, then you've got something that's close to usable, but that's your minimum. And I don't know many people that are going to, go and talk to 50 to test their theory effectively, right?
Yep. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing, yes, I mean, finding 50 people to talk to is hard, because it takes a lot of work to try to get actually somebody to take a phone call, especially now, frankly, post-COVID. I think it was easier pre-COVID than it is now. I also I think when you can ask, one personal finding, frankly, like to bring up a run one example, a fairly recent one technique I like to do is, in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the meeting, switch completely from pitching mode to pessimist mode. So we're 45 minutes in. Is the problem that we're talking about important enough to solve that X? Is it important enough to solve that it's in your top 5? Is this important enough to solve that it's really worth onboarding a new vendor? Is it important enough to solve that it's really worth working with a product while it's in beta or maybe even in alpha? Is it really important enough that it's worth you doing like a bi-weekly meeting with the vendor just to get our roadmap right? Is it really worth it? And very often what I've found is that people will say no, which is deflating.
Yeah.
And then they'll say, but what I really want is, and then they're, oh, okay, well, I could build that. And very often it's a very close tangent into the thing that you've been talking about for 45 minutes. And then you really wonder, so for the first 45 minutes, you've been so kind and so nice and nodding this entire time. And yet there's actually something so much more important that we could have been talking about, and we totally whiffed it.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a thought-provoking question. It's not one which you can just close without a real thoughtful answer. And I think, again, it comes into our founders that afraid that what they've been investing their time and effort into thus far is actually flogging a dead horse. The saying goes, it's a product that isn't viable in the market. Ask that very difficult question, get sidestepped, and then take a step forward instead of 10 back, right?
100%.
Yeah. And how because I know that you said you've had quite a complicated process with Run when building your MVP and building. Talk me through what's been complicated and how you've kind of overcome that.
So we had to do a major pivot, and for what it's worth, my prior startup, we also had to do a major pivot. At Big Switch, we were 2.5 years in. We had to do a gigantic pivot, and after that pivot, built the company up to about $70 million in sales. Pivots, I don't see pivots as bad. I see them as inevitable. For Run When, first thing I do is this exercise, right? I actually lined up 50 people who said, hey, if I buy this, will you build it? And all 50 said yes. We started furiously working on the MVP when we started to have something that looked like a reasonable demo and almost looked like a system that people could use, kind of surfaced back up. This was about 6 months later, and started saying, all right, will you start taking us into beta? Will you start taking us into a POC and see, we know we're early. This thing clearly doesn't entirely work, but there's something there. When we resurfaced, the economy was just starting to turn. This was the beginning, it was like first quarter of 2022. Across the 50, by the end of 22, every single one had had a layoff. And I would say the design partners that sort of the 50 that started saying yes, if you build that, I will buy it. When push came to shove, only about 10 of them even survived the first 6 months of 2022. And by the end of that year, across those 10, our champions in 8 of those companies had been laid off themselves. And the last 2 had been so reorged, they were this is just nowhere on our priority list.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's one that I have been more conscious of in probably the last 10 months, 11 months, I would say, about the importance of frequent check-ins, like product check-ins, service check-ins, if you're offering a product or a service, because the market, the buyer persona, how transactions are actually being conducted has changed so much and so quickly. I think companies that haven't had the open mindedness to check in at the end of every week or at the end of every month to say, right, is our product still viable? I know we did the MVP, but let's check back in. Is that kind of what's been at the front of your endeavors with building this product in getting it right and keeping it right?
I think for us, this was an extreme. I mean, the economy just completely turned underneath us.
Mm-hmm.
And we went from, the original sort of pitch was, hey, this is a tool that like at Google SRE teams would have considered to be absolutely critical. And over, we were finding teams like, hey, we're 5 people now, but we're going to be 10 people in 12 months. And we'd love to like be modeling our operations after Google. We've read the Google SRE book, et cetera, et cetera. And then once we were ready, when we came back, oh, it turns out we're 5 people. We're not going to be 10 people at the end of this year. We're going to be 3 people. And we need to go cost savings all over the place. And suddenly, if it's not a cost savings journey, then we're just not interested. Like we are hunkering down. Like our team is going to be smaller and not bigger. And we started hearing that over and over again. We just built this product that was clearly for teams that were in expansion mode, and there weren't very many of them in the industry. So we had to do a big pivot and figure out a very, very different kind of product concept that was really for teams that were in contraction.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of runway discussions, to say the least, and I think people now, like we were talking about before the call, the burnout rate that I saw at the end of last year was incredible. And the pressure on, I know we're talking more on the emotive side than actually what the product itself can do. The burnout rate was high. The mental health, the anxiety in people being pressured to do 3 or 4 people's roles, and they're still one person, without increased budget to do so, to bring tools in. And obviously you wouldn't have had that insight had you not been consistently checking in with the market, checking in with the customers. Where are the market conditions going? And I use an analogy, and it's an analogy that I use with the CEO that I mentioned to you before, who unfortunately failed in his business because he was watching the red ball. The dog was chasing the red ball over the cliff without knowing that the cliff was coming. Got the ball, brilliant, yes, over the cliff we go. And that was because he was so focused on features, making features and releases that were built on a product that wasn't actually fit for market, and his business failed because of it. And again, this is why I emphasize, I think, the importance of regular check-ins and product checkups and service checkups and customer checkups. Is it still a thing? Can we still, in 6 months' time, have a viable product? And like you said, you've now done this multiple times with your last startup you mentioned. What do you think was the biggest lesson, from the first time that you had to do a complete market shift, a pivot, to this time, which you've recently done it? What were the key burns that you had, which made you think, right, that's how I've got to do this time. I don't want to make that mistake again.
Sure. I mean, I think 3 things matter a lot. I think the speed of the pivot matters a lot. So when you decide that you're going to pivot, recognize that you don't have a perfectly clear vision of what you're pivoting to. But once you've kind of mentally kind of gotten over the hump of, hey, the original idea is not going to get us where we need to go and we need to move on to a new idea. I think, take a couple of days off with a notebook, not a computer, just handwrite. It's my process, handwrite, to try to get that as crisp as you can. Say to the team, hey, look, we're going to pivot, and set deadlines for both yourself and the team that are pretty tight to say, hey, we need to know we need a new product concept in 4 weeks. Okay, we need to have the first beginning customer conversation on this new product concept in 6 weeks. Okay, that means that we need to have a rough slide deck in 2 weeks and a customer ready slide deck in 8 weeks. So you start setting these very, very, very micro steps. So I think speed of pivot is really important. Having fewer people rather than more. That big switch, we had to pivot when the team was already 75 people. It's a gigantic leadership challenge because a lot of the people that look around and say, hey, I don't find the new vision terribly inspiring, or like, that's just not why I joined. And very often they'll sort of say yes to the pivot, but they'll actually really be like fighting against it, saying, this is not that much is changing.
Yeah.
I think a small team is really, 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 really important, because the more people you have, the longer that the whole pivot process is going to take, and the messier it's going to be, and the more elements of the old that need to get dropped out.
Mm.
And then the third thing is trying to get everybody on the team, including yourself, to just forget the past. And that's really, really, really hard. So, hey, everything we're proud of and everything we're embarrassed about iteration one, zip it. It doesn't exist. We're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And that's very, very, very healthy. And for most founders, it's incredibly embarrassing.
It's a good point. And, one thing that I always say is don't let your ego run your business, because it's a recipe for failure, for disaster. And any way disaster can be, categorized, whether it's mental health disaster or actual financial failure. And I've, my second startup now that this is, I've got another one building after that. And every startup I did past that, I had less ego and less ego. It was beating out of me every day of being a startup founder. But what's your tell? Do you have a tell? Because there'll be a lot of people listening, and they'll be hopefully scribbling notes, and they'll be thinking, right, okay, so build an A team that you can get into a boardroom, get them out, get into the countryside, take a notepad and your dog, and just sit and scribe whatever your innovation process looks like mentally. Um, but they'll be thinking, but how do I know when to do that? Is there like a point when you're already in operation, your product is already live, perhaps, or in production, to think, right, whoa, okay, warning, red flag, red flag. Let's get the A team together.
So for me, it was all timed around a conference. We were kind of just starting to recruit more and more beta customers. And this conference was perfectly timed because we had just done a beta release that let us really have confidence that we'd get beyond our initial 5 design partners. This was a year and a half ago now, pre this pivot. I went to the conference and I had 40 conversations, just at the lunch table, over coffee, kind of just walking around. Out of those 40 conversations, I wound up with 0 POCs. I had 37 people who said, hey, sorry, we don't have budget for anything like that. I had 3 people who said, oh, we have budget in our organization, but I'm actually not your ICP. I'm just here because, she wanted a friend, or he wanted a friend, like, to come to the conference, and I was kind of curious. Like that's actually the person that you want to be selling to. And then I said, so do they have budget? And so, oh, no, that person doesn't have budget. So 40 conversations, and I couldn't find anybody like who had budget to start a POC. If as the founder over 40 conversations, if I go 0 for 40, to me, my minimum is I have to have at least 15 people out of 40 that I can get to start a POC, and then hopefully 10 of them that sort of conclude into something, say, oh yeah, we're interested in your product, and then 5 of them that kind of turn to paying customers. Because if I can't hit those kinds of conversion rates, there's absolutely no way that a professional salesperson can. Like, your founder there's such a strong social contract. Even if you're a terrible salesperson, even if you're not persuasive at all, like, there's such a strong social contract that your customers have with you, where you have to say, look, I'm all in on making this work for you. A typical sales rep will never have. Your conversion rates just have to be 3 and 4x. You just assume that. And so if you look at your own conversion rate and then you divide it by 4 and you say, okay, that's the productivity of the first salesperson that I hired, this business is not going to get off the ground.
Yeah. And I think I actually had a conversation on Friday with a serial kind of founder, investor, CRO, go-to-market specialist. And he kind of really emphasized that point on having data to take to market and having the value already clear, and then the pricing and the sales should take care of itself. But you obviously have to speak to 40, 50 people, which is where people perhaps sometimes struggle. And I do think, having had these multiple conversations now on this podcast, and multiple times that I've sat and spoken to people like yourself, I think the right questions to ask. And I think you just started to probe into that. But you can go to KubeCon and you can spend 2-3 days having meetings, without really probing into what are the hard questions, what are the killer questions I've got to get off. Is there any advice, really, any reading, any material, or any literature that has helped you on your journey outside of being burnt, which all startup founders are, that you would recommend people go and put their time into learning and reading?
I think so. The 2 books that I mentioned before, Steven Finger's book and then Bob Tinker's book, I personally love, since I'm kind of enterprise infrastructure, enterprise sales, and I tend to gravitate to products that are new category creation. I really
Mm.
love Wars Crossing the Chasm. Um, that book for me has just played a very, very important role in my life. Uh, there's another, it's not even a book, it's just an article by a guy named Mark Leslie. He's a professor at Stanford. He was on my earlier board. He was a founder of Veritas. The Sales Learning Curve, I think, is a great short article. It's an HBS article that I love, and I recommend that one a lot. I think that probably for me, given my own kind of personality as an optimist, and it's like I just would, and a little bit of like the ADD, like I love to, ooh, hey, talking with this person, hey, here's a new idea, here's something new that we
Yeah,
could.
oh, I'm very much the same. I know exactly where you're coming from.
I find for me, I was shocked. It was really the first VP of sales we had for Big Switch, and the guy was gifted, a guy named Dave Butler.
Mhm.
I remember the first call, 4 or 5 customer conversations we went into. I would be pitching my heart out and telling me how good this thing is. And then in the last 15 minutes of the meeting, Dave would kind of take over the conversation. And I was expecting him to like walk in and somehow magically close the thing. And instead he'd be like, so is any of this worth it to the customer? And I'm like, I was furious the first 2 minutes. Dave, what are you doing? You sound like you don't believe in this product at all. And he's like, I'm just doing my job. He was very cagey about it. But it was brilliant to really carve off a quarter of every meeting to switch from optimism to pessimism and have him ask, is this worth your time? Is it worth our time? And then he would ask things like, when was the last time you personally brought a new startup into this current organization? And somebody said, I never have. Then he'd be like, so what are the chances that we're going to be the first? Really? Oh, think of all the things that could go wrong. I mean, he was extraordinarily pessimistic.
Mm.
And it was amazing to see how much that exercise really told me about where we really were relative to product market fit. Because I thought that I was, I was getting to the 60-minute mark in all of these meetings.
Yeah, without getting that real insight with that hard question asking.
Yeah.
Mm.
This
Yeah,
thing was look for the no, and if you can find it very easily, then you move on.
I went to an event called SaaS Stock. I don't know if you've heard of SaaS Stock. It's where a lot of SaaS founders gather, that are looking to start up businesses. And I took an idea there that I built a pitch deck for because I knew there's going to be loads of founders and VCs, and I got slammed like by every one of them. I'm pitching this idea, and they're like, "What?" And come the end of it, I probably spoke to 30, 40 people, but they all gave me great feedback. It's not scary. I know a lot of people kind of think, oh God, I can't, I don't want to get told that my product is stupid and be made to feel stupid. It's not the way to frame it in your mind for me. Go there and try to look stupid. Go there with something to say, this is what I'm trying to build. What do you think? And typically, exactly like you say, you'll get constructive feedback. If you ask the hard questions, people will give you constructive feedback and help you and nudge you one step closer to actually, right, this is now an MVP. And on the back of that, I've now iterated my own product. It's on a much smaller scale than actually what you've been involved with, but still, the process I think is the same. Go and ask a question. Don't be afraid to look silly. Take the feedback, further develop your product, and then you're going to come in with something that perhaps has started here, now it's up here, but it's sellable. It's a product that you can go and take to market, right?
I mean, it's amazing to me to see how very often in the niche that you can find where a customer really has the problem, a very, very bad, angry version of the problem, so that it's worth it to them to work with a new
Mm.
customer. It's so hard to predict, and it's so different from where your product will be at maturity. One of my first products, I was a product manager for Cisco's mid-range and low-end wireless LAN controllers. So this was a better way of doing wireless LAN. And we said, look, this is so obvious. Like, of course, every business that's providing wireless LAN to their employees is going to want this. And so we started selling to enterprises through Cisco's traditional sales channels, and it didn't go particularly well. The product was raw. Um, and, anyway, I won't get into all the detail. Turns out for universities, it was a life changer. It was so much better than the systems that all these universities had in place. And suddenly we're like, really hot in universities. And then suddenly a handful of universities started having security problems. So we added a couple of security features to it. And awkwardly enough, it was actually those security features that then made the thing take off in the general enterprise market. No way I would have predicted that one. And all of my mentors at the time, they kind of kept on saying, Kyle, like you can't predict anything. So just have like hundreds of conversations. I mean, I never would have predicted that universities would be the rocket ship for wireless LAN controllers.
And again, it all comes from having what some might consider to be scary conversations, conversations where you're going to be emotionally perhaps vulnerable, when in fact all it's actually doing is refining your product and making it adapt. And I think obviously with Runway, you've come into a market where it's quite bloody waters. Dev first startups, a lot of developer teams, a lot of developer centric startups have entered the market in the last however many years. How many iterations of your product have you had from what was in there initially to actually where it is now?
I think that we had this one big pivot where we were very focused originally on SLOs and how do you manage a different way of monitoring to very much troubleshooting and runbooks, which was, hey, what do you do when the alerts go off? And can you do that more efficiently? The general problem area, hey, teams that are fairly new to Kubernetes hasn't called the audience has not changed for us all that much. We've been very, very consistent. And I suspect if we change that audience, it would be better to not do a startup, go back to some large company, get to know that audience very well, and then start the startup all over again. We just happen to all be kind of Kubernetes folks. So it's a problem domain that we're kind of put the team together to solve these problems with new Kubernetes teams or applications that are just ported over to Kubernetes. So I'd say kind of the general end user is an end user that we're very, very familiar with. And a lot of the problems that they deal with day to day are problems that we're very, very familiar with. So I'd say for us, like the really big pivot was to say, hey, that SLOs was kind of an aspirational way to manage your team, whereas dealing with alerts and dealing with colleagues asking for help troubleshooting was a much more what we thought was like basically when you're expanding, you want this wildly new thing, and when you're contracting, you need to find out how to respond to as many alerts and as many questions from your colleagues just with fewer people as you possibly can. So call it same audience, but actually materially different problem that they have in their day-to-day that we were really faced with solving.
Yeah. Right.
We also had the very unique thing, like OpenAI hit the market, and for us, I was initially very, very pessimistic. And then we kind of had a lucky moment. My wife and kids were out of town. I spent a weekend prototyping. In one weekend, popped out a V4 of our search engine that was better than any of the 3 iterations that we'd ever built before. And that suddenly became the basis of actually a huge product shift. That was pure luck. I mean, that was pure luck. That's not replicable, but I would say the part that really is here's the audience that I care about. I'm doing lots and lots of conversations with people in that audience, very regular ones, and I'm constantly doing 45 minutes of optimism, 15 minutes of pessimism.
Yeah.
To really, harden the idea before doing too much development and before hiring too many people.
Yeah, and I think you have to be in the environment to get lucky. I know you said it is lucky, but if you think about Arnold Palmer's famous quote, the more I practice, the luckier I get. And for you to know how to kind of put yourself into that mindset, into that environment where you can, hash things out, you can brainstorm, you can do the things that help you, get your head above the parapet and see in. That's for me as important as anything else. The amount of fans that I've spoken to, and again, referencing back to the guy I spoke to who failed, he didn't take time out. He didn't take a day or two away to, like we joked about earlier, to go walk in the mountains or the woods or whatever with a pen and a pad and just walk and think, phone off, leave it in the car, whatever, take the dog or the cat for a walk, and productize and think, how can this iterate? What can I do? And it sounds like whilst you were lonesome for the weekend with your family away, it gave you that opportunity to be lucky.
Yeah, very much so. I mean,
yeah. I suppose the point I'm making is if you're a founder, if you're a startup, or you're trying to build a product, take some time out to look in. Take that time to have mental clarity.
Yeah, I think taking the time both in called the 1 hour customer conversation and taking the time out every month or every quarter
Mm.
to instead of saying, hey, how can I make this successful? Instead saying, all right, what can cause this thing to fail
Yeah.
is really, really, really valuable. And articulating those risks and getting comfortable with them and then starting to take action on those. It's this
Yeah.
like weird pessimistic viewpoint that I think if you can carve out some time to do it, at least for personalities like mine, sounds like for yours, like it helps keep us on the right track.
Yeah, and I think, knowing the potential risks, the potential failures as to why, your startup could effectively fail is a great thing to do. I actually read. Have you ever read Sun Tzu before?
Mhm, mhm.
So Sun Tzu, I'm gonna read this quote because I'm writing a book at the moment. I've quoted this, and it says, "Know the enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril. When you are ignorant of the enemy but know yourself, your chances of winning or losing are equal. If ignorant both of your enemy and of yourself, you are certain in every battle to be in peril."
Yeah.
So know every opportunity in which you can fail is the point, and map it out and know a pathway away from the dreaded F word.
Yep.
Yeah. Look, I think that's a brilliant place to finish with that kind of advice. I could honestly talk to you all day because this is for me an exciting topic. I love building things and growing things and getting the MVP right, but I've taken a lot of your time already, Colin, and I'm very grateful to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to the next. I love these kinds of conversations. I hope that they're useful to
Yeah.
somebody other than two of us.
Yeah. If we can help one person between us, we've done something positive for
Good
the
enough.
universe.
Good enough.
Wicked. All right, Carl. Great to see you. Have a good day.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.